第二场专题演讲呢，我们邀请到欧洲国际政治经济中心的李木山浩史主任。李主任呢，专精于贸易外交、欧盟的远东关系和数字的经济，也是许多呢政府及国际组织定期就贸易谈判、经济改革等议题呢咨询的对象。在本次的论坛当中呢，他将和我们分享欧盟碳边境调整机制对于主要贸易伙伴国的影响与因应。我们欢迎李主任。
Distinguished scholars, colleagues, and friends from Taiwan, it's a great honor to be invited by CIER to present to you on Taiwan and the EU Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, which has now been tabled by the European Union. And my name is Hosukli Makiyama. I'm not just a trade lawyer and economist, but I also comment occasionally on the commercial relationship between EU and Taiwan. And I believe CBAM proposal will have a profound impact on that relationship, not just with Taiwan, by the way, but also with many third countries. And if we start with the very basic concept of the EU CBAM, what is it? Well, CBAM is not a tariff or a fee, but a border adjustment similar to what is applied on imports at the border of the European Union, for example, on value-added tax that is being applied on all sales within the European Union. So in other words, this is actually an adjustment for a carbon emission right that is normally paid internally within the EU for goods and products that has been manufactured inside the EU. So the carbon border adjustment mechanism is effectively a method to equalize imports from countries that are actually not paying the similar fee. In the EU, we have something what we call the Ets system, which is the emission trading system for polluting sectors, for CO2, nitrous oxide, and PFCs, which is a residual that is created in the aluminium production. But in effect, emission right has to be purchased by almost all sectors, and in order to offset the cost of emitting these undesirable emissions into the climate. And in Europe, the prices are actually for these emissions rights are actually determined by a cap and trade market exchange, similar to how a stock exchange set the price for any kind of a scarce resource. And this currently affects around 10,000 installations, and it will be more in the power sector and the manufacturing industry, as well as aviation. And very soon also other form of transports. Currently covers around 40% of European emissions. And of course, if you have an ambitious emission trading system and carbon pricing mechanism, as Europe desires to have, it also means that there are increasing concerns within Europe about carbon leakage, which means basically that European industries will move abroad and start producing and manufacturing in economies that has no carbon pricing or carbon trading. And in order to address this, and very often in the vernacular of, for example, level playing field and making sure to secure European competitiveness, European Commission, which is the common executive branch of the EU, has presented its draft for introducing CBAM on 5 sectors, which is steel, aluminium, cement, fertilizer, and electricity. And of course, there is a political reason behind each one of those. Steel and aluminium, for example, are also subject to Section 232 tariffs in the United States, and many people see CBAM as a retaliation against the US. Cement is usually not traded, but there are many European cartels in producing cement. And where there is a risk of imports coming from non-EU countries in southeastern Europe towards the border of Balkans. Fertilizers suffer from similar occurrences, and electricity is actually a sector that is not covered by the WTO and is simply exempt from WTO commitments. And we will come back to the point about WTO in a second, but as we will see, the presentation focused very much on the legality of the CBAM and how a potential dispute will play out. But before we get there, let's look at the impact on Taiwan, because that's what we care about most. And CBAM basically mandates all EU importers, not Taiwanese exporters, to buy so-called CBAM certificates, and each certificate corresponds to the price that would have been paid if the good had been produced under the EU's carbon pricing rules, which means that if you emit 1 ton of carbon, for example, in the EU, you would have to pay a price, I think today around 55-60 euros. And if you have a good that has emitted around 1 million ton, you have to pay the equivalent price when the good enters into the EU. For Taiwan and its export, it will be equivalent to roughly 23 billion new Taiwan dollar worth of trade that will be actually affected by CBAM on iron and steel, aluminium, fertilizer and electricity that is under the scope of CBAM proposal, and if it had been introduced today, of course. And I would say that most, if not almost all of it, is in iron and steel and related products. CBAM will be actually introduced in 2 stages. In the first stage, which is going to be a preparatory stage, which lasts from 2023 to 2025, there are actually no fiscal implication, meaning that there are no CBAM fees to be paid. Importers are required to submit reports as they would have when the CBAM proposal is fully implemented, and they would also have to apply for import authorization, meaning that there's a reporting duty and there's actually a de facto import licensing requirement. Exporters, like Taiwanese producers, may register with a database that will be maintained by the European Commission, although this will not be mandatory. In this database, the producers, for example, of Taiwanese steel would have to surrender information about their production processes. At this stage, it's actually not entirely clear how much or what kind of information that would have been surrendered, and the design of the database is not entirely clear. In the second phase, starting from 2026, importers would need to actually purchase real certificates and keep them on a certain account where they would have to surrender each certificate equivalent to the imports that they are importing from a third country. And these certificates will be priced at the average weekly price of EU ETS, meaning that it will be essentially equivalent to producing a good inside the European Union. In other words, if you import a ton of steel from a third country, you would have to actually pay the equivalent of the emission of that steel. And this leads to a number of complications, but at this stage, the most important point is perhaps that in Europe we have something called free allowances, which means that we have an emission trading system, but we also have exemptions, which means that a number of sectors have received free allowances in order to exempt them from this system. So, in other words, in order to implement CBAM and not be discriminatory, we would have to give up these free allowances, which otherwise would be an illegal subsidy. And this is all planned within the EU proposal, that they will need to be phased out in a proportion to actually the implementation of EU CBAM. And it goes without saying that it will have a severe consequence on some exporters who wants to export to the European Union. Firstly, as I mentioned, you would need to register with the database, and their emissions levels would have to be verified by an EU accredited verifier. That means that somebody probably from Europe would actually need to go and actually verify the emission levels of Taiwanese facilities. And if an exporter fails to register or just simply don't want to because it might require too much administrative burden, Or it could also mean that there's just too much sensitive corporate information that you don't want to share because actually the database will be public. That means that the European Commission will establish a national value for Taiwan through a methodology that has not been determined. And there will be a markup to that value. So in other words, if you are running a very efficient plant in Taiwan, it might be in your interest to register and comply and get your values verified by an EU accredited verifier. If you refuse, the Commission will just use the average of your country based on whatever data that is available, probably from a third party. And on those occasions where the Commission cannot actually establish a national average value using scientific data and third-party data, it will simply create a fictive price based on the worst 10% polluters of any given period in the EU, which means that, to take it step by step, if a Taiwanese exporter fails to register, then we are looking at the national average. If the national average cannot be established by the European Commission, they will look at the worst polluters in Europe and use their values in order to calculate how many emissions that needs to be purchased. And that will probably result in a tariff equivalent of at least 20%, and we can actually guess this based on roughly average price of steel and also based on the worst polluters that tends to be in Eastern Europe and their efficiency when it comes to emissions on blast furnaces leads us to a calculation that is at least 20%. In other words, this will be a considerable amount, which will have a deep impact on a commodity like steel or aluminium. So this raises the question, is this actually in accordance with WTO rules? Well, it depends. Let's first look at the obligation that you have under the WTO. First of all, there is the MFN principle for like products. Is a ton of steel a like product with another ton of steel? Probably yes. CBAM at prima facie is actually a violation of MFN. And on also the fact that you are using the worst 10% as a benchmark to calculate the emissions is another example of a MFN violation. And of course, if you have a difference in application of the domestic ETS system versus the external CBAM system, that is a violation of GATT Article 3, which is the national treatment. And I would argue that just the additional burden it creates by reporting, and also you need to have legal records on, for example, the good legal standing of the company that is importing actually from Taiwan. So an importer who buys certificates must show that they're actually a good standing company in terms of in the eyes of the law. And this kind of requirement doesn't actually exist within the EU system. And also penalties in terms of sanctions are much more severe in the external CBAM rather than the internal ETS. Alternatively, there is an idea that the idea that you need to acquire licenses in order to import from other countries and to be a part of the CBAM system is a de facto import licensing scheme. And the WTO import licensing agreement has certain requirement in terms of rigidity of what kind of requirement you can put, for example, on developing countries. Some lawyers may even argue that it is a quantitative restriction of GATT 11 and potentially also a technical barrier of trade. And we believe that most of these arguments will be presented by third countries during a feedback process that is currently ongoing. And I suspect that also many of the people in the industry from Taiwan will be submitting their views around the WTO compliance and their perspectives on CBAM. So continuing further, you can have a number of violations of basic commitments under the WTO, but there are also exceptions. And EU would argue this exception to say that the CBAM proposal actually is in line with the WTO rules. EU will seek to justify these violations under GATT 20, which is the general exception, and particular in terms of B and G, which is to protect public health or the environment. The questions that the WTO panel would actually answer in this regard is, for example, is CBAM really aimed at conservation, or is it more of a commercial policy to level playing field? So actually, is it actually CBAM necessary to achieve the results that the EU claims that it has or it wants to seek? So, in other words, EU must be able to prove that carbon leakage is actually a problem, and the CBAM is a genuine way to solve that problem and not to disguise these restrictions on trade. And furthermore, it needs to show that CBAM leakage is not just a problem, but there are no less trade restrictive alternative available to the EU that is at least reasonable. This is what the WTO jurisprudence called least trade restrictiveness test. And there are a number of broader questions that comes to mind, and which will also be asked by the panel eventually, which is that shouldn't the EU recognize their alternative means of reducing carbon than a cap and trade system? Can you work with incentives rather than, well, a carbon pricing? Taiwan has cut its emission impressively without having a carbon price system. What's the problem with that? And also, furthermore, in order to actually justify these measures that EU has imposed, EU must show, at least in some degree, that it has engaged in serious good faith negotiation actually before imposing CBAM. Before you take a unilateral measure, you must be able to show that you have tried to negotiate in good faith. This is also something that comes from case law in the WTO and, for example, in the US shrimp case and other cases as well. And moving on, I would just say perhaps that it is very likely, or at least likely, that CBAM in its current form will be challenged in the WTO. There are just so many outstanding questions. There are so many aspects that are unclear that I believe that many third countries will simply seek the litigation route in order to get clarity, but also to show that the EU proposal could be implemented in a clearly discriminatory manner. However, we should not assume that we are looking at the final draft law, because the EU political system works very different than the Taiwanese or any national system. It is supranational. It works with supranational institutions. And in the EU, this proposal will first be subject to a scrutiny by the European Parliament, which is separate from the national parliaments, which is a unique parliamentary structure that only existed in Brussels, that has its own members. It would also need to be ratified by the Council, and which is another unique body for the EU, which consists of all the 27 member states. And each of these three institutions, European Commission, European Parliament, and the European Council, will have the ability to amend and have deciding votes. That means simply that these three institutions would have to negotiate in a classic political negotiation in order to arrive to a final text that they can all live with. They will each try to make their own amendments to put their footprints, their characteristics to them, And of course, it will be of high political importance because they will be able to say to their voters, their countries, to say, yes, I have achieved the following changes in a landmark legislation. But we should bear in mind that for the moment there is no real decisive majority for CBAM amongst the important member states, notably Germany and France. And France is also heading towards a very contested presidential elections. And we have seen a number of demonstrations in France in a movement called the Yellow Jackets or Yellow Vest demonstrations, where people have been contesting higher fees and higher costs, mostly for environmental reasons, which they don't accept. And some of these protests have turned violent. And also a majority of the member states are in favor of more stringent environmental requirements, especially if it's paid by a non-EU country. But a number of them will say that the timing is relatively poor, as with the case of the French elections, or that they have steel or cement or aluminium industries locally in their countries who are opposing this because they will be losing the so-called free allowances that allows them to exempt themselves from the ETS system. This, of course, creates a lot of room for changes and not least lobbying from the industry and the member states, and a number of gaps, inconsistencies and unclarities in the current proposal may be really deliberate because the European Commission knows that a lot of it will be redrafted anyway. So this is what we are looking at now, essentially, is basically an opening bid from one of the three institutions that will play a big role in shaping the final legislation. And there is actually quite a lot of people in Brussels now who said, well, CBAM will never happen, it's too complicated, there's just too much opposition around the world. And I would just say that all politics is domestic, even here in Brussels, which means that, well, it's the domestic stakeholders, not the foreign diplomats or trade negotiators, that determines how the political system actually reacts. Furthermore, what most people will tell you, especially if they've been in Brussels for a while, is that very difficult legal proposals like CBAM, that no one really believes will happen, tend to happen all of a sudden when no one really expects it. And it will be passed when no one really thinks it will be passed. And partly this is because CBAM is an integral part of a political agreement that made the current executive branch, the European Commission, possible. So in other words, forming this political or member state majority that support the European Commission and the commissioners who are now currently in charge, CBAM was a key important part for a number of countries to say yes to the Commission President and other leaders. That means that even if nobody actually wants CBAM, it may have to happen because you need to start to unpack the whole political agreement that exists around the current administration. And that is something that is extremely difficult to do. So in reacting to this, I think that a number of the third countries are basically playing wait and see. Let's not protest too loudly until we know where EU might end up. I believe that many of them are also counting on the legal proposal to completely fail and get stuck. That would of course be the cheapest and the most efficient solution for if you're objecting to CBAM. And a number of countries, especially for example the United States that I mentioned, that has its own Section 232 tariffs, mainland China and Turkey also have very strong defensive interest against the European Union because they are running actually trade deficits on steel against the EU. So in other words, the steel industries in these countries may actually, and the steel industries in these economic systems might actually prefer to have protection rather than getting market access to the EU. There's been also a slightly more constructive approaches. For example, the UK has said that they will prefer not to link their own ETS system. As you may recall, UK left the EU, and when they left the EU, they also left the EU ETS system, and they created their own. They have no intentions or political will to actually to relink their UK ETS system with the EU one. But they are proposing a conceptual idea that maybe there will be a room for a global emission trading system, and UK will be prepared to link their system to a global one, but not the EU one. Furthermore, I think there is an interesting case of a few countries, notably Korea and perhaps also Ukraine, but also to a certain extent the system of mainland China, that has their own ETS systems. It is relatively easy to argue that, well, take for example the example of Korea. They have a system that is very similar to the EU. It just so happens that it produces a much lower price for emission rights in Korea. Is Korea having an unfair advantage? Not necessarily. I mean, for the same reason that the electricity or labor or taxes are different in different countries, you could very well argue that each country must be allowed to have their own ETS system that creates its own unique outcome. So according to CBAM system, if you have your own carbon pricing, it doesn't have to be a ETS, but if you have a carbon tax, for instance, you can deduct that part that you paid in your home country and when you export it to the EU. So you basically only pay the difference in CBAM. As long as you keep all the receipts and they look legit, the European Union promised that you can actually deduct what you've been paying. It has a couple of flaws. One is that you still need to go to the administrative requirement. And since ETS is actually not paid by the exporter, by the importer, that means that an EU customer might say, actually, it's so much easier to buy from local EU producer, because if I choose a Taiwanese producer, I have to go through all this administration. So that is slightly discriminating on its own. So these countries that have their own ETS system will say, well, not just deducting the price, we would like to be exempt from the whole system entirely. So we would like to have our own lane going into the EU market. The other concern that could be raised from countries that have their own ETS system is, as I said, the price difference is actually an effect of market forces. So in other words, why would they need to pay the difference? Then they could argue that a German car imported into, for example, say Korea, enjoy an unfair advantage because, well, certain inputs or maybe certain taxes are cheaper in Germany than Korea. So they would have to introduce their own border adjustment for these measures. So there is some logic to that, at least as long as your national ETS system is covering steel, aluminium, fertilizer, cement and electricity, at least those sectors that the EU covers. The final point that I would just perhaps add is that since that we can now see that there are a number of steel industry primarily that has their own defensive interest against the EU, as we mentioned, and there's also a group of countries who might say, we have our own ETS system, we want to exempt ourselves from the EU system, but we don't care so much from the others. The question arises immediately, who would challenge the EU in the WTO? Who would actually dare to litigate? Probably a country that has nothing to lose. We have a number of developing countries, India, of course, South Africa, but also relatively unknown trade flows from countries like Mozambique that export considerable amount of steel and aluminium to the EU. We have also Egypt, and these countries actually have very little litigating experience in the WTO. For example, the last three that I mentioned have not raised a case on their own against another WTO member ever. So a high-profile case like this, of course, requires a lot of budget, and it also requires quite a bit of stamina in terms of political will in order to push through a litigation like this and see it through until the very, very end. So developing countries have a unique interest. They may not be in a position to introduce their own ETS system or carbon pricing, but they also have a unique legal basis in some of these respects, because there are WTO exceptions for developing countries and special consideration that has to be paid to them, especially for regulatory complex systems and regimes like the one that is being introduced by EU CBAM. So I will conclude with this point, and I look very much forward to your, well, recorded or live questions. I'm not really sure how we are going to do this, but I always look forward to interacting with my Taiwanese friends. And thank you so much for having me, and thank you to the organizers.